Have you ever stopped to think about the foundations of something we often just accept as modern science? Like psychiatry.
Yeah, we tend to see it as, neutral empirical, based on facts.
Exactly. But what if the real story is, well, a lot more complicated? Maybe shaped by histories we've forgotten, philosophical questions that got ignored, maybe even political forces.
Hmm.
Welcome to the deep dive. We unpack complex ideas to give you that shortcut to being well-informed.
And today, we're diving deep into Psychiatry and Power, Memory, Madness, and the Ethics of Healing by Skylar Fiction.
It's a really fascinating analysis, pulls from different fields, and it definitely challenges some core assumptions about mental health care.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to explore how psychiatry, maybe not always consciously, but how it's functioned historically as a cultural, sometimes even political instrument.
Right, we'll look at the ethics, the philosophy behind it, some historical practices.
And some really surprising ideas about what healing actually means, all drawn straight from these sources.
Hmm.
Yeah, get ready to see psychiatry in perhaps a new light.
Okay, let's start unpacking this. The essay kicks off describing modern psychiatry as a paradox, even calls it a cathedral built on fog.
Strong image.
Yeah, suggesting its foundations are unclear, its moral bearings inconsistent. I mean, for a field so central to how we understand the mind, what does that really imply?
Well, the core argument here is pretty compelling. It suggests psychiatry's evolution wasn't just, straightforward scientific discovery. It's also about what it chose not to look at.
Like what?
Things like its own history, philosophical questions, and maybe most importantly, the actual voices of people labeled mad.
Mm.
And the author brings up Stephen Hyman, former head of the NIMH, right? He actually admits the current diagnostic system. Well, it lacks validity.
Wow, from the director.
Yeah. He says it relies more on clinical consensus doctors agreeing than on solid biological proof.
So that raises a huge question, doesn't it? If the diagnoses aren't really rooted in biology, what are they rooted in?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What the sources seem to suggest is this fundamental incoherence. Psychiatry prescribing treatments with a lot of certainty.
Even when it doesn't fully know what's biologically going on.
Precisely.
Mm.
There's a study mentioned by Don DeQuesteniet and others, finding that most psychiatric writers just kind of sidestep the whole mind-brain problem.
As if the philosophical underpinnings just don't matter.
Kind of. And this silence, it isn't neutral, right?
Yeah.
The sources argue it allows for practices that end up being ethically and existentially impoverished.
Okay, so connecting this to the bigger picture, the sources draw this, frankly, startling parallel between modern psychiatry and the European witch trials from centuries ago.
Yeah, and it's not just presented as some quirky historical fact. It's about understanding this deeper cultural instinct, to label and sort of purge people who seem to threaten social norms.
This example they give is really illuminating. The 1608 trial of Godelieve Keynes in the Spanish Netherlands. Rudy Lerman's looked into it. And she wasn't condemned by some angry mob. It was a whole state apparatus. Administrators, priests, even early medical figures.
So very official.
Very. And the accusation against her, witchcraft, it apparently functioned a lot like a modern diagnosis. It gave her situation a name, a cause, and a justification for intervention.
Reducing her complex situation to a simple spiritual pathology.
Exactly. The goal wasn't finding truth. It was about reproducing the moral cosmos, keeping social order intact.
Which inevitably makes you look at today's DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
The Diagnostic Bible?
Right. Does it, despite its scientific appearance, still echo some of that? The sources suggest, maybe it's often more about norm enforcement than pure empirical precision.
Still relying on that clinical consensus, like the witchfinder's intuition almost.
In a way. And you have powerful players like insurance companies, pharma firms. They create this complex lattice of responsibility where the actual patient's voice can get lost.
Even the language used, like borderline personality disorder, the sources argue it can carry these hidden moral judgments.
It's subtle, but potentially powerful.
Okay, so moving from these deep historical roots, let's talk about a more modern technology. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, introduced back in 1938.
Ah, yes, ECT. It almost immediately became this symbol of progress for some, but also incredibly controversial for others.
So what's the interesting angle here in the sources?
Well, Stefania Mangini talks about this electroshock triangle. It's this kind of battle for the narrative between Italy, where it originated, the U.S., and the global psychiatric community about who invented it, what it meant.
So the machine itself became a sort of symbol.
Almost a stage prop, as the sources put it, for how psychiatry wanted to present itself. And then, films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest really cemented that image of ECTS.
Psychiatric force authoritarianism.
Exactly. And there were efforts, apparently, with the Menninger Foundation displaying an early ECT machine, but removing Cerletti's original inscriptions, attempts to kind of sanitize the historical record.
To gain legitimacy, maybe? Without the uncomfortable history?
To shed the haunting of its rituals is the phrase used.
Wow. So what's the takeaway then? The sources aren't saying ECT never works today, right?
No, they acknowledge reported success in some cases now, but they really stress the ethical shadow cast by its history, especially the forced application.
On vulnerable people.
Particularly women, institutionalized populations. Jonathan Andrews' work is cited, highlighting how early patients often got ECT without anesthesia, without muscle relaxants.
It led to
violent seizures, broken bones, immense psychological terror. Horrific stuff.
And the critique is that psychiatry tends to downplay this.
A tendency to erase or minimize its own participation, using its epistemic power, its power to define what counts as knowledge to sideline survivor stories.
Which brings up a really fundamental question. Can a system truly heal if it suppresses the memory of the harm it caused?
That's the crux of it. And this pattern, this control and silencing, it becomes even clearer when you look at psychiatry under certain political regimes.
Okay, let's get into that. Communist Albania is a key example in the sources.
Right, documented by Roland Grabowski and Drayton Dishavishka. Psychiatry there essentially became an arm of the state.
How so?
They adopted a Pavlovian framework, all stimulus response. Mental illness was basically reduced to dysfunction in stimulus response patterns.
So very mechanistic, stripped of meaning.
Completely. Psychiatric hospitals became places for silencing, not healing. If you dissented or even just expressed strong emotions, it could be recoded as pathology.
And the official journal just towed the party line.
Filled with panegyric and enthusiastic praise for state doctrine, yeah.
But the sources warn this isn't just some historical anomaly from a totalitarian state, right?
Exactly.
Right.
While Western psychiatry isn't usually under direct political orders like that, the argument is it's not immune to ideological capture.
Meaning?
Well, the DSM criteria themselves are shaped by culture, culturally embedded. And we see how certain groups, racial minorities, LGBTQ plus folks, the neurodivergents, are diagnosed, medicated, sometimes institutionalized at higher rates.
Which forces you to ask, who gets to decide which minds are okay and which need correcting?
A deeply political question, ultimately.
Speaking of ideology, this leads us to the really fascinating story of psychedelics.
Ah, yes. Mid-20th century, substances like LSD showed huge therapeutic potential initially.
Patients reporting things like mystical insights, deep emotional breakthroughs.
Yeah, Langlet's and Dick's work highlights how they were first seen as vehicles of healing, potentially opening doors to transcendence, not just pathology.
But then things shifted dramatically.
Right. As they spilled into the counterculture, they got criminalized pretty quickly in the late 60s.
And the argument is this wasn't just about public safety concerns.
The sources suggest it was also an assertion of epistemic authority. Psychiatry, especially the dominant biomedical paradigm, focused on classifying and normalizing.
It couldn't really handle a substance that seemed to challenge its basic truths, that exposed the contingency of their truths.
Precisely. So what happened? Research funding vanished. Clinical trials stopped dead.
A deliberate delegitimization is what the sources call it.
Yeah. And now we're seeing this renaissance, right? Psilocybin, MDMA showing real promise for PTSD, depression.
Which makes you ask, why was that promising research shut down for decades?
The suggestion is that psychedelics threaten the established psychiatric model, not because they don't work, but because they make the invisible visible. They push beyond just brain chemistry.
They hint at dimensions of mind and experience that don't fit neatly into the biomedical box.
Exactly, which ties into another major theme, this push in psychiatry towards seeing itself purely as a biological science.
Sometimes called reductionism, leading to the erasure of the subjective mind.
Right. And again, Stephen Hyman is quoted admitting that decades of brain science have actually yielded only modest progress in understanding the root causes of major mental illnesses.
So the diagnoses in the DSM, they're still based on
symptom clusters, agreed upon by committee through consensus, not typically based on identifying the underlying biological cause.
Hyman's phrase was measuring smoke and calling it fire.
A powerful critique. And it raises the question, when you reduce complex suffering just to neural dysfunction, what gets lost?
You risk dehumanizing the person?
The sources argue it amputates meaning from experience. It overlooks the social context, the existential weight, the moral aspects of suffering.
And philosophically.
Authors like Thomas Seuss and Sabine Schlimm point out that most psychiatric literature just avoids the big questions about mind, self, free will, which leads to conceptual incoherence.
The idea of the theater of diagnosis you mentioned earlier, Ian Hacking's work, that seems really relevant here.
Absolutely. His theory of dynamic nominalism, the idea that our diagnostic categories actually change the people being diagnosed.
So the label itself shapes the experience. It becomes a narrative scaffold.
Right, and the DSM gets described not just as a manual, but as a cultural artifact, even a secular scripture.
With the power to diagnose things like disobedience in children as oppositional defiant disorder.
Which is controversial, yeah. And this diagnostic theater, the sources emphasize, is often deeply racialized, gendered, and classed.
You mentioned Metzel's research.
Yeah, showing how black men might get diagnosed with schizophrenia, while white women with similar symptoms get mood disorder labels. It's complex. For some, a diagnosis is a relief.
But it can also absolutely be a tool of social sorting.
A way of managing populations.
Okay, so amidst all these critiques, which are pretty heavy, the sources also point towards something else, right? A counter-narrative.
Yes, and this is really important. It's about the possibility of growth and transformation within experiences often just labeled madness.
Like,
there's emerging research on post-traumatic growth, or PTG, specifically in people who've experienced psychosis.
Post-traumatic growth after psychosis. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, based on standard models. But Rachel Shaw and colleagues did a review, finding many individuals report things like increased personal strength, spiritual development, deeper relationships, a renewed appreciation for life after psychosis.
So not just getting back to normal, but actual growth.
Exactly. These are described as testimonies of survival, reframed through the lens of narrative integration, making meaning out of the experience.
Which really challenges the dominant psychiatric view of psychosis as just a brain malfunction to be fixed.
Right. Instead of seeing it as a void to be filled with medication, the sources suggest we should try to hear the intelligence of the wound.
Amen.
Seeing things like hallucinations or delusions not just as errors, but potentially as complex expressions of psychic overwhelm and symbolic repair, attempts by the psyche to communicate or cope.
So recovery isn't just symptom reduction, it's more like a passage through fire.
A transformative journey. And this obviously raises a big question for clinicians. If psychosis can be a site of growth, does the role change? From just symptom suppressor
To something more like a meaning companion, helping navigate that difficult journey.
Precisely. And this all leads to confronting this fundamental divide that's haunted psychiatry. The rational versus the irrational. The sane versus the mad.
Let's unpack that. The sources link it back to the Enlightenment's focus on reason. Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
Exactly. And in that framework, madness became the negation of reason, making the insane seem somehow less human.
Foucault's work, Madness and Civilization, comes up here.
Yes, framing the asylum not just as a hospital, but a moral machine where reason actively policed unreason.
In that view, psychiatry didn't just discover madness.
It effectively invented it as a category of social exclusion, a way to manage those who didn't fit the rational ideal.
And this still echoes today.
The sources argue yes. Diagnoses like antisocial personality disorder or schizophrenia carry these unspoken judgments about goodness, compliance, stability.
And there's a selective focus in society, isn't there?
Definitely. Crimes by people labeled mentally ill gets sensationalized, reinforcing stereotypes. But violence against mentally ill individuals, often ignored, underreported.
Suggesting psychiatry can still act as a kind of gatekeeper of social trust.
Right. Which prompts this really profound question. What if madness isn't the opposite of humanity, but maybe one of its most honest expressions?
Maybe the mad aren't lost, but are wounded truth tellers, revealing things society doesn't want to see.
It's a radical reframing. And to really get this, we also need to see how psychiatry has operated in times of crisis.
Like epidemics.
Exactly. Dusan Kipmanovich's work, Psychiatry in the Time of Cholera. During 19th century cholera outbreaks, the fear wasn't just about the disease.
It spread to people's behavior.
Yeah, fear of contagion became linked with fear of disorder, irrationality. People acting erratically were seen as threats to social stability. Asylums expanded.
So madness itself got conflated with contagion.
It shows how easily psychiatry could be instrumentalized during states of emergency, used to control populations under perceived threat.
And the Albanian example under communism you mentioned, that's the extreme version of this.
A chilling example, documented again by Kekmanovic, psychiatry as a direct arm of state repression. Dissent literally rebranded as mental illness. Hospitals as soft prisons.
But the warning is that similar dynamics, maybe more subtle, can exist even in democracies.
That's the argument, citing things like the overmedication of incarcerated people, involuntary holds for the homeless, psychiatric evaluations for protesters.
It makes you ask, when psychiatry is used to restore order in a crisis, whose order is it and who pays the price? Especially those whose suffering doesn't fit neat boxes.
A critical question about power. Which brings us to the end point of this deep dive. A call for a fundamentally changed psychiatry, one that actually remembers its past.
The sources argue it's been a discipline defined by forgetting, right?
Forgetting the people harmed, sterilized, shocked, locked away. Forgetting the times it served the state over the individual soul.
And the proposed solution is memory.
Memory, if taken seriously, can become medicine.
Oh.
The call is for psychiatry to kind of decenter science a bit,
Sure.
put it in dialogue with history, philosophy, lived experience, and crucially, moral humility.
So the future isn't just about finding the next blockbuster drug.
Not solely. It depends more on their rediscovery of meaning within human suffering.
And they make this distinction between treatment and healing.
Yeah, that's key. A person can be stabilized without being restored. A symptom can be reduced while the soul remains fragmented.
Wow.
And drawing on that post-traumatic growth idea, if psychiatry embraced that, it wouldn't just ask, what's wrong with you?
You would also ask,
What has happened to you? And maybe even, what might you become through this experience?
which leaves a big question for you, the listener. What would it actually mean for healthcare to shift? From just diagnosing problems to really accompanying someone on that journey of transformation.
It implies deep changes.
What kind of changes?
Things like psychiatric training, including ethics, narrative medicine, diagnostic processes that are genuinely collaborative,
Yeah.
making forced treatment an absolute last resort.
And involving survivors more.
Absolutely. As co-creators of care,
Yeah.
it even calls for public accountability, maybe truth commissions, for the profession to honestly say, we were wrong about past harms.
That's a huge ask.
It is. But the final message is pretty powerful.
Ugh.
Only the truth can set a broken field free.
So we've covered a lot of ground. How psychiatry, aiming to be scientific, has also been this powerful cultural and political force.
Yeah, this deep dive into psychiatry and power reveals this really complex history of moral judgments, control, but also this surprising potential for growth even within madness.
And it leaves us with this thought. If real healing means more than just fixing symptoms, if it involves honoring meaning and memory, how could we all individuals, society, approach suffering and difference differently?
Maybe with a bit more humility, a bit less fear.
How do we make sure that care genuinely serves the person and isn't just about enforcing norms?
Big questions to ponder. We really encourage you to sit with these ideas, see how these historical and philosophical points resonate with your own understanding of the mind, of well-being, of what it means to heal.